what we really need to look at now is respiration, which is the use of the energy. So in plants, both photosynthesis and respiration occurs. Animals depend on the biomass produced by photosynthesis as the energy source for their respiration. And it's this process of respiration that drives work. And I'm using the word work in the terms of all of the operations, all of the processes that any organism needs to complete is driven entirely by the energy released in respiration that's initially captured from photosynthesis. So if you have a look at the little diagram there, in photosynthesis the plant produces glucose. This glucose is available to be laid down as new material, biomass. We actually call that primary production, and we'll look at that in the next video. Some of the glucose itself is actually used as an energy supply to drive the cellular processes. We call that process respiration. And again, from grade 9 and grade 10, you should be okay and happy with the idea of respiration. But also in respiration, because it's an energy releasing process, heat is released. So there's a byproduct of the process that isn't just work, there's a byproduct that is released as heat energy, and that heat energy is transferred to the atmosphere. That increases the entropy in the atmosphere, but the release of that energy allows the entropy inside an organism to actually remain much lower. Again, let's have a look at this in terms of a very simple flow diagram. So respiration is the release of energy from glucose and other organic substances. Glucose isn't the only substance that can be used in respiration. Quite a lot of the simple sugars, fructose for instance, can be used directly by organisms. And it's this release of energy that's important. So again, we have inputs. We have glucose and oxygen as the inputs this time. We have energy release that can be used for work, but we also have the release of carbon dioxide and water in the process. And the conversion process, the transformation process is the respiration. How do we know water's released? Well, if you go and breathe on a window, you'll get water vapor actually on the window. And that's one way of showing that water's released in this process. So again, flipping this a little bit, again, our inputs, we're just looking at the same thing, but various ways of looking at it. So our inputs are glucose and oxygen. The oxidization process in the cells, so what happens is that the glucose is oxidized in the cell. This releases energy for work and some heat. So using the idea of a zebra, zebra takes food in, plant material. Cellular respiration oxidizes the glucose and releases energy to drive life processes. In that process, some energy is lost to the atmosphere as heat. Oxygen comes in from the atmosphere to drive the process as well, the oxidization of the glucose, and carbon dioxide and water vapor are both released as well to the atmosphere. Now, what's not included in there is the fact that respiration is also used to lay down some biomass. So if we have fuel, if we have more glucose than the system needs to do the work, the remaining fuel is laid down as biomass, and we'll look at that in the next video in much more detail. So the glucose isn't only used to drive the organism system. So remember, it's also used to make biological molecules. So like I said, we'll look at that in the next video. And let's think about what's happening with this energy that's lost from the system. And remember, in terms of this, it isn't lost from the ecosystem, it's lost from the system inside the organism. Okay, so respiration dissipates energy as heat. So some of the energy is lost, it dissipates, it removes it from one system and puts it into another system. This increases entropy in the ecosystem. Remember, entropy is the idea that energy sources become more disordered the more they're spread out. But this also allows the organism to maintain order and a relatively low internal entropy. So inside the organism, we actually have low disorder. That allows our systems to work. So again, we can think of this in terms of what's happening with these transformations using these Odom diagrams. So this isn't very, very different from the last diagram. It's just that this time our energy source is stored biomass. our work that's being done, our process, is actually the respiration, and we're getting this kinetic energy of work, and we're getting some heat. That's where the symbol is different. We're getting some heat lost from the system. So we've got stored chemical energy, which is being transformed into kinetic energy and heat. Yeah, the kinetic energy is doing work. So let's think of this in terms of the actual system itself. So this is a very, very simple ecosystem. It's got some relationships that are happening, predator-prey relationship and herbivore relationship. And again, in topic 2.1, we use this one a few times. So the zebra are eating plants and the lions eat the zebra. So that's how energy is moved through the system. So if you notice next to each of them, they've actually got this word trophic level. And trophic level just means the level they are inside the feed-in relationship. So plants capture the sun energy and convert it to glucose. But herbivores eat plants and carnivores eat herbivores. Each of them are at a different feed-in level. And this word trophic comes from the Greek word troph, which just means food. Yeah. So an old English word for feed, to eat too much, is to trough. Yeah. So trophic level 1 are the producers, the plants. They produce all of the energy, all of the biomass that is available to the rest of the ecosystem. Trophic level 2 herbivores, we can also think of in terms of being something called primary consumers. They are the first consumers of biomass. And then the lion in this case is the carnivore. This is a secondary consumer. It consumes biomass that has been created through the primary consumer eating the biomass that's been laid down by the producer. And it is really this first trophic level, the autotrophs. That's another word. So this word autotroph, we can talk about the producers as being autotrophs. They auto-feed, if you split that down into Greek. Yeah, auto, self, troph, food. So they self-feed. And they support the energy requirements of all of the other trophic levels. So again, taking this idea back, it is the energy captured in photosynthesis that provides the energy for all of the ecosystem, as well as producing glucose that's used to lay down biomass to create new biological molecules. So thinking about the detail is this, it's possible to classify the way organisms obtain energy in two categories. So we either have organisms that are producers, or autotrophs, which is a better word. Yeah, they self-feed. These manufacture their own food from simple inorganic substances, mainly plants. But remember, there are some autotrophs called chemoautotrophs that can actually use chemicals directly, and most of those are found very, very deep in the oceans where light doesn't penetrate. And then we have the consumers, or heterotrophs. Different feeding. Hetero just means different, trophs means food, so they are different feeders, and they feed on autotrophs or other heterotrophs to obtain their energy. So we've got herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, detrivores, and decomposers. Yeah? And they all feed within a feeding hierarchy within the ecosystem. And this feeding hierarchy produces a food chain. And again, in grade 8, 9, 10 probably, you will have come across the idea of food chains in the past. But it's a hierarchy, it's a hierarchical, and it's a feeding relationship. And the energy flows in the ecosystem can be illustrated. So the food chain is not illustrating food being passed on, it's actually illustrating energy being passed on. And the arrows show the direction of energy flow. So we've got energy moving from the producers to the primary consumers. We've got energy then moving from primary consumers to secondary consumers. And then we've got energy moving from secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. Okay, that was quite a quick look at that. And like I said, in the next video, we're going to go on and look at the feeding relationships in more detail and how we can model and look at those relationships. But for the moment, I'll leave you with this. I obviously used the diagrams that Howard Odum created in the 1950s, but I took them from a version of it that was published in 1983 rather than the original 1950s version. Remember, whenever you can, always cite where your sources came from. If you want to read further on this and actually get some more background that covers the next bit of the presentation, the next bit of the course as well, a very, very good article is actually uses Odum's work that he did on the Silver Springs River catchment in the USA to illustrate how energy flows through the ecosystem. It's quite a nice little article, and it has some questions that you can actually fill in and get answers as you go along. So it's quite a nice way of reviewing the unit. Okay, so that's it for now, and thanks again.